This video was made with support from my patrons, whose names are on screen now. If you want to, you can join them today and even get access to exclusive content. The link to my Patreon is in the description, so check it out if you're interested. Anyway, on with the show. I think now is the time that we finally talk about the big hitters. The cars that have become almost synonymous with Gran Turismo itself. Yes, I've already covered quite a number of cars from Gran Turismo on this channel, coming in all shapes and sizes. Cars that have become loved, cars that have become hated, and cars that are just plain goofy. But now, we're taking on the cream of the crop. I've discussed the cars that Gran Turismo has made famous, but what about the cars that arguably put Gran Turismo itself on the map? Models that have become so intrinsic to the fabric of the series that to not include them in these games would seem unthinkable. This is what we're handling today. Now, some of these cars may seem too obvious to even mention, but I assure you, they have some fascinating stories to tell, both in real life and with how they tie into Gran Turismo lore. There's no more of a surefire way to make a Gran Turismo icon than to have it be the hero car of one of these games. Our first case is possibly the best example of this that you'll find. The Ford GT is a car that needs no introduction, but I'll give it one anyway. It's the successor to the original Ford GT, better known as the GT40, that won the Le Mans 24 Hours on 4 occasions in the 1960s. But let's talk about how it appeared in Gran Turismo. As many of you will already know, the Ford GT was the hero car of Gran Turismo 4, as shown by the box art of the game. At the time, the car was completely new, with production of it only starting in the middle of 2004. Despite this, it had already appeared in the series thanks to Gran Turismo Concept in 2002. The pre-production version of the car was featured here, looking very similar to the final model. One very direct way in which the Ford GT ties into Gran Turismo is through series producer Kazunori Yamaguchi. He actually owns a GT in real life. Now that in and of itself isn't too surprising. He's owned many different cars, including a Nissan GT-R, Porsche 911 GT3, and Honda S2000, among many others. But what is interesting is that he actually owned 2 GTs. This is something that he explained himself in a bonus video from Gran Turismo 5 Prologue, as well as the fact that he considered the GT to have the best body design in the history of automobiles. Now that is what I call a compliment. Given all of this, it is not at all surprising to see the GT have such prominence in the series. But beyond the standard road car, there is another version of it that is even more iconic to these games. Taking a look at the intro movie to GT4, you'll find this, the Ford GT LM race car. This is an entirely fictional version of the GT created by the Gran Turismo team, and it's most likely the car that you first picture when thinking about GT4. It predated the real Ford GT competing in any professional series. The first of those was in the GT300 class of Super GT in 2006, campaigned by DHG Racing. It's worth noting that at one point there was a yellow livery planned for this car, as shown very briefly in a DVD that came with the Asia exclusive Gran Turismo 4 The Bible guidebook. Another oddity would be the driver names. They seem to be copied from the Mercedes CLK LM, as they show Klaus Ludwig and Ricardo Zonta, the 2 real-life drivers of the number 2 Mercedes in the 1998 FIA GT Championship. Anyway, even though the road car is the one that appears on the cover, to me, and I suspect many others, the LM race car has always been the true hero car of GT4. Beyond the intro, it just seemed to have more of a presence in the game. And of course, it is the prize car given for winning the GT World Championship. Personally, I think this was the perfect choice. I've mentioned the odd driver names, but what about the racing number? Number 4. It's pretty self-explanatory, right? Number 4 for Gran Turismo 4. Well, yes, but actually there's also another more overlooked meaning. Consider this. This car is called the Ford GT LM race car Spec 2. Back in GT Concept, along with the concept road car, you could also find the original GT LM race car. Back then, it was known as the Ford GT Concept LM. This car is often forgotten, as the Spec 2 came along and stole its thunder. But also, aside from its livery, it looks pretty much identical to the regular concept car. As far as GT original race cars go, this was a pretty basic one. But what's important to note is that it too sports the number 4. This was long before GT4 had been announced, so the use of 4 in this case was actually in reference to the original GT40's 4 consecutive wins at the Le Mans 24 Hours. Of course, the throwback Golf livery is also part of this. If we then skip past GT4 onto GT5 Prologue, we can find this: the Ford GT LM Spec 2 test car. It once again bears the number 4, and with no possible relation to GT4, that confirms the true meaning of the number once and for all. Another interesting point is that the Spec 2 race car was still based on the concept version. This is most obvious by looking at its headlight design. The Spec 2 test car, on the other hand, was based on the final production model. Each of these cars would appear in GT5 and GT6, but sadly, neither the Concept LM nor the Spec 2 race car would appear in GT Sport, but the test car would be added in an update during 2018. Of course, this was most likely because the test car was already a full PS3 quality premium car, whereas the other two were just ported over PS2 models. However, for Gran Turismo 7, the iconic Spec 2 race car made a return. It was now heavily based on the test car, as shown by the production car headlight design and the tow hook location being the same. However, the two weren't identical. Aside from the livery, the test car has front canards, which the race car doesn't, and each have a slightly different rear wing design. Despite now being fully based on the production model, there is one small detail still carried over from the concept car. This is the wheel design. Both the test car and the Spec 2 race car have always used the wheel design from the concept, for whatever reason. With the race car's reappearance in GT7, they also finally updated the driver names to now show Kazunori Yamauchi and Yukiharu Taniguchi, who worked on the opening movie of GT4. As far as I can tell, they never worked on another GT game after this, so that's an interesting throwback. The Ford GT LM, in any of its 3 forms, has always been a very solid car. In events like the Dream Car Championship, for example, it's always one of the toughest opponents, and a very strong choice should you decide to use it. Being a GT original race car makes it quite unique among the other iconic cars from this series. Sure, there have been other memorable ones, like the Mitsubishi GTO LM, Pagani Zonda LM, or even something more recent like the Peugeot RCZ Group 3. But none of them have left a legacy as strong as the Ford GT LM. There is a reason why it is the only pre-GT5 original race car to have returned to the series. But even if it were to never catch on with the players of these games, I feel like they still would have brought it back anyway. Why? Well, no reason in particular. I think that Gran Turismo 3 is a good place to determine what counts as an iconic Gran Turismo car. You see, after Gran Turismo 2 featured more than 600 models, GT3 was scaled back to not even 200. Despite this, it still contained many cars that people would consider as particularly memorable, be them already established fan favourites, or exciting newcomers. The point being that any car that made it into GT3 had some sort of value and reason for appearing. If you've fully played through this game, you will likely know about what I call the Big Three. These are the 3 toughest opponent cars you'll find in the entire game, outside of the F1 machines. They mostly appear in the late game championships, but each of them have an interesting story. Let's start with the Nissan R390 GT1. This car is often not the outright fastest of the big 3 when they all appear together, but it's still pretty damn quick. It seems to not wear out its tyres too much, and so can complete some races without needing to make a pit stop. That is unless you race at Laguna Seca, where it does its best impression of the Shelby Cobra. This car debuted in GT2. Not only did the more familiar 1998 version appear, but also the black and red 1997 car. Although from GT3 onwards, only the 98 would appear alongside its road car counterparts. There isn't too much to say about the road car, other than the fact that it has always been somewhat underpowered at around 350 horsepower. Officially, this is what Nissan rated the car at, but it's believed that it actually produced more, around the 550 horsepower figure, just like the race car. Either way, this is how it was represented in Gran Turismo. But in GT3, the race car would also have an error. It only weighed 900 kilograms, compared to its actual weight of 1000 kilos. This would be corrected in future games, but it does help to explain why it's so fast in GT3. In GT4, the R390 would be one of only a handful of cars to receive a secret black variant that would appear in the used dealership for only a few in-game days. The real-life car was developed jointly by Tom Walkinshaw Racing and Nismo in 1997. It was designed to GT1 regulations, as the name suggested, hence why one road-going example had to be built. It was actually partly based on the design of the Jaguar XJR15, which had previously been developed by Tom Walkinshaw Racing. The car only competed on 2 occasions, once at Le Mans in 1997 and again at Le Mans in 1998. In 1997, Nissan entered 3 cars, with the leading car starting the race in 3rd. Unfortunately, all 3 cars suffered with gearbox issues, and only one car was able to finish down in 12th. 1998 was much better though. Qualifying was not as strong as the lead car was only 10th. But in the race, many of their competitors had reliability issues. This allowed the number 32 car to finish in 3rd, behind only the 2 Works Porsches, and impressively, the other 3 Nissans all finished in the top 10 as well. After this, the R390 was retired and replaced with the R391 Le Mans prototype. In the realm of Gran Turismo, the R390 has been somewhat overlooked in favour of the other 2. It also appeared in GT5 and GT6, but only as a standard PS2 model, and since then it hasn't returned. It's kind of a sad end when you think about its peak appearance in GT3. But on the other end of the spectrum, we have the Mazda 787B. The 787B was the only Group C prototype to appear in GT3, and therefore the first ever Group C car in Gran Turismo. From that, you might expect it to be overpowered, given what we would see in future games, but this isn't at all the case. It's actually pretty balanced with the other 2. This car is famously won from the Like the Wind event, meaning that it isn't too difficult to get. You just need a road car with a load of power. I suppose the discussion around the 787B's real-life story is always a popular topic, so we might as well cover it. Mazda had been competing in endurance racing for a while, but without a huge amount of success. They were able to achieve some class victories at Le Mans, on account of often being the only cars in the IMSA GTP class, but they were able to finish 7th overall in 1987 and again in 1989. For 1990, they introduced the 787, featuring a 3-rotor engine dubbed the R26B. The new car was considerably faster than the old 767, but neither of the 2 cars were able to finish at Le Mans, leaving the 767 to once again win the GTP class as the only car left running. For 1991, the 787 would evolve into the 787B. Now, there are 2 common trains of thought when it comes to the 787B. Either it was a beast of a car that exploited a loophole in the rules, meaning it had to be banned, or it was a complete failure that somehow lucked into a win at the most prestigious race of the year. As with most things, the truth lies somewhere in the middle. The 787B was never quick over 1 lap, there's no denying that. But it did have solid race pace on account of its fuel efficiency, and being kind on its tyres thanks to its low weight. This is a quirk that is also evident in Gran Turismo when compared to the other Group C cars. And ultimately, it was these factors, along with incredible reliability that its competitors seemed to lack, that helped it secure an unbelievable victory at Le Mans. The winning car was the number 55 machine that was entered as a one-off, hence why it ran a completely different livery to the two regular cars which came home in 6th and 8th places. In case you're wondering, Renown was a Japanese clothing company that supplied race suits to the team. Sadly, they filed for bankruptcy in 2020, but even still, their name will forever be immortalised on the side of that Le Mans winning 787B. Like the R390, this car would also have a secret black variation in GT4, but unlike the R390, it had a much better fate thereafter. It was rebuilt as a full PS3 spec premium model in GT5, the only Group C car to get that treatment. It also returned as DLC in GT Sports, and was then carried through into GT7. Here's some interesting points. In GT3, this car is incorrectly labelled as a turbo. This was corrected in GT4, but when it returned in GT5, it featured made-up driver names in place of where the real ones should be. This was eventually corrected when it came back in GT Sports. So then, let's tackle the final of the big three. To me, the Toyota GT1 is the most iconic of these three cars. Not the most iconic generally, that would have to be the 787B, but the most iconic to Gran Turismo. Once again, this car debuted in GT2 with two versions, the 1998 Spec and the 1999 Spec. They were two of the fastest cars in that game as well, but only the latter would return in GT3. In terms of pure speed, the GT1 is on average probably the fastest of the three, but it does suffer from worse tyre wear. Outside of being an opponent, it's also known for the final test of the Supra license, where the player is tasked with beating a lap time in it at Monaco. This is often considered as one of the hardest license tests in Gran Turismo. It was also used in the final test of GT2, but this time at Apricot Hill. Another claim to fame this car had in GT3 is that it was often used to perform the wheelie glitch, given that it produced quite a lot of downforce which was necessary to pull it off. The other car that was more commonly used for this was the Pikes Peak Escudo, which I talked about earlier in this series. It too is one of the fastest cars in GT3, but fun fact, it never appears as an opponent anywhere in this game. Alongside the race car, GT3 also featured the GT1 road car. Visually, it just looks like the race car but without a livery, and performance-wise it's not that far off either. This is one of the few elusive models to not return in GT4 for unknown reasons. When it comes to the GT1 in real life, it was developed in 1998. It was built to GT1 regulations like the Nissan. Toyota famously got around the requirement for the car to have enough storage space for a standard briefcase by insisting that, in theory, it did have the space in the fuel tank. In their first attempt at Le Mans, they brought 3 cars and managed to qualify one of them in second. Unfortunately, that leading number 28 car would crash out in the race, and the number 29 would suffer a gearbox failure when contending for the lead. The sole surviving number 27 car would finish down in 9th. For 1999, the GT regulations were changed, meaning that the GT1 was no longer eligible, so the car was adapted into the GTP prototype class. At Le Mans, Toyota would achieve a 1-2 lockout in qualifying. They were the odds-on favourites to win, but both cars suffered major tyre failures during the night, causing accidents that would force both to retire. The sole remaining number 3 car then went on a charge to catch the leading BMW, but it too suffered a high-speed blowout. In this case, it was at least able to keep going and came home in second place. But the story doesn't end there. The GT1 competed in a third and final race at the 1999 Fuji 1000 km. Its only real competition was a single Nissan R391 and a BMW V12 LM entered by Team Go. It was easily the favourites, once again qualifying on pole, but the team were given a penalty during the race for overtaking under a yellow flag. They could never make up the time they lost and so were beaten by the inferior R391. And that ends the real-life story of the Toyota GT1, one of the fastest cars to never win a race. Just like the other two I've mentioned, the GT1 also had a special black version in GT4. In fact, the big 3 make up most of these, with the Nissan R92 CP, which was new to GT4, being the outlier. For a while, the GT1 seemed doomed to a similar fate as with the R390. It returned in GT5 and GT6, but was never remade as a PS3 premium model, and moving on to the PS4, it didn't come back. That was until earlier this year, when the GT1 made a triumphant return in GT7. To be honest, this was long overdue. To me, the Toyota GT1 is one of the cars that first comes to mind when I think of Gran Turismo. Of course, this being Gran Turismo 7, its return wasn't without confusion. This car was put into the Group 2 class, as opposed to Group 1 where the other prototypes are, like the 787B. It seems like this was done for the sake of continuity with the CLK LM and F1 GT-R, two cars that also competed in GT1 in 1998. Frankly, I would have just bumped up the power and put it in Group 1 anyway, but whatever. Now it races alongside stuff like the SC430 GT500, because sure, that makes sense. Anyway, a common trait you would have noticed is that each of these three were Japanese cars that competed for the overall win at Le Mans, with differing fortunes. The Nissan never really looked quick enough to do it, but still achieved third in 1998. Also, through strong reliability, they managed to get all four of their works cars in the top 10 that year, which is actually incredibly impressive and something that doesn't get mentioned often enough. The Toyota was kind of the opposite. It easily had the pace in both 1998 and 1999, but was struck down by a combination of reliability issues and just sheer bad luck. The usual story for Toyota at Le Mans. And we all know about the Mazda. Reliability, consistency, and strategy were the pillars to its victory, and it became the first Japanese car to win Le Mans, and the very only all the way until 2018. So next time you come up against these cars in Gran Turismo, just remember that they each have an interesting story to tell. They are the Big Three. Or should I say, the Gran Turismo 3. You know what's a car that almost everybody loves? Debuting in Gran Turismo 2 was the TVR Speed 12. GT2 had many weird and wonderful vehicles, but the Speed 12 is always one that stood out. It truly looked like nothing else, and even more surprising was the fact that it was conceived as a road car that anyone could buy. The version seen in GT2 was the original concept car first shown at the British Motor Show in 1996, then known as the Project 712. It had a 7.7-litre V12 engine boasting over 800 horsepower. The reason why I say that almost everyone loves it is because if you've ever driven it in GT2, then you'll know that it's quite a handful. Near undrivable, some might say. I talked about this car back in my infamous cars video, and that was for one specific reason. This car can be won from the third race of the GT All-Stars event at Red Rock Valley. Given that it can be continuously won and then sold for 500,000 credits a pop, it represents easily the quickest way to make cash in this game, and possibly the most broken, repeatable money-making method in Gran Turismo history. But the story of the Speed 12 in this series goes a lot deeper than that. This car was conceived to compete in GT1, and even race at Le Mans as early as 1997. Sadly, this never happened, as the car was already obsolete when it arrived in 1998. It would have stood no chance against the likes of the Mercedes CLK LM, Porsche 911 GT1 98, or Toyota GT1, which were all purpose-built race cars, unlike the Speed 12. Even still, it would eventually compete in the GT1 class of the British GT Championship in 1998. In GT2, if you perform a racing modification on the Speed 12, it will turn into that very GT1 car that competed in British GT. In real life, the car only appeared a handful of times, but scored a best finish of 4th on debut. After that, the GT1 rule set was abandoned, as we've already discussed, and so the Speed 12 was left with nowhere to race. But in the meantime, TVR was still hard at work on producing the Speed 12 as a production car. In 2000, they would complete what was now known as the Cerbera Speed 12. The following year, this version would appear in Gran Turismo 3. It's fair to say that the Cerbera Speed 12 is more fondly remembered than the concept car, and I'd wager that Gran Turismo is a key reason why. I mean, who could forget its exaggerated styling, ridiculous colour options, and ludicrous speed? It was so quintessentially TVR. Despite being a road car, it can really hold its own against the race cars in GT3. Although the Cerbera was planned to go into full production, this never happened. It's a rather well-known story that the boss of TVR at the time, Peter Wheeler, drove one of the finished models home and declared that it was simply unusable on the road. After that, all of the orders that had already been placed on the car were cancelled. However, what's often forgotten is that the Cerbera Speed 12 also briefly competed in British GT. It was developed into a GT2 car for the 2000 season, and competed for 3 full years, achieving a decent amount of success. They notched up 3 wins and 15 further podiums against the likes of the Lister Storm, Marcos LM600, and Dodge Viper GTSR. In 2001, a second Cerbera GT2 was even built to compete in some rounds. A road-going Speed 12 was eventually sold a few years later, adapted from one of the race car chassis, as you can see. In Gran Turismo, the 2000 road car would go on to appear in GT4, GT5, and GT6. Sadly, it wasn't given a premium model in the PS3 games, but it was well known particularly in GT6 as one of the few cars that could go well over 300 miles an hour. Once again, this is another car that is yet to return to the series, even though it really should. It's because of Gran Turismo that we even remember the car in this form at all. The 2 examples of the car that still exist are based on the race car, featuring aggressive aero. And yet for many, the enduring image we have of the Speed 12 is the 2000 model that was in GT for so many years. It's quite telling that when the Speed 12 has appeared in other racing games, which has happened quite a few times, it's rarely ever the original concept or even the race car based existing one. Instead, it's the 2000 car, the one that was supposed to go into production but never did. And guess what? Gran Turismo was the very first to feature this particular model. Of course, when it comes to Gran Turismo, it's not just about the Speed 12. TVR as a whole became famous internationally as a result of appearing in the original Gran Turismo. You could even argue that these games are the reason why TVR started selling cars in Japan in the first place, and since then, the brand has gained a surprisingly large following in the country. Really, the Cerbera Speed 12 is just the figurehead, the unobtainable halo car that summed up what TVR was all about. Through this, it has firmly secured its place in Gran Turismo lore. Well, there's no getting around this. Now it's time to talk about the single most iconic car in Gran Turismo. The car that, no matter how many others they may include, will always be at the top of the pile. Ladies and gentlemen, the Toyota Castrol Tom Supra. What more can be said about this car? If any were to encapsulate Gran Turismo as a franchise, it has to be this one. Let's start with its real-life story. This car was campaigned by Team Toms in the 1997 All Japan GT Championship. Driven by Pedro de la Rosa and Michael Krum, they won 2 races that season and secured Toyota's first ever JGTC title. It was a close fight with Toyota stablemates Team Sard, but after both finishing on 67 points, Toms won it on countback. This already secured the car's place in history, but what happened after that, surely nobody could have expected. But first, let me ask you a question. Which was the first Gran Turismo game in which this car appeared? Simple enough, right? Well, the answer is Gran Turismo 5. Let me explain. The Castrol Supra has been almost ever present in this series from the very beginning. However, if we go back to the original Gran Turismo, you'll find this, the Toyota Castrol Supra GT. 1995 was the first time we would see the Castrol Supra when Team Toms entered the JGTC, securing the marque's first ever win in round 3. But the car that's actually depicted here is the 1996 Castrol Toms Supra. This car didn't achieve any wins, finishing 8th in the championship in a year where Team Go and their McLaren F1s dominated GT500. In GT1, the car, which appears front and center on the main menu, is not fully licensed, hence why it's known simply as the Castrol Supra GT with no mention of TOMS. It also featured some alternate color schemes, those being white, blue and red, black, green and red, and black, blue and red. The black version was even given as a prize for winning the Grand Valley 300km endurance race, the marquee event of GT1. The car would return in GT2, where its alternate colour schemes would be removed, but it would also be joined by the 1999 Castrol Supra. In real life, this car was more successful than the 96, but less than the 97. It scored 2 wins and finished second overall in the championship. This car would be fully licensed as the Castrol TOMS Supra JGTC. Moving on to GT3, we would find the 2000 Castrol TOMS Supra. Up until then, the Castrol Supras always had a decent presence in the game, but GT3 would be the first time that one would be cast as the hero car. It featured prominently in the game's intro movie, using a mixture of real-life footage and pre-rendered game footage. In-game, it could be purchased at the Toyota dealership for 1 million credits, or you could have a 1 in 4 chance of winning it from everyone's favourite event, the Professional Vitz Race Championship. Oh boy. The irony of them choosing this car to take centre stage in GT3 is that 2000 was a really bad year for TOMS in GT500. The number 36 finished 17th in the standings, with a best finish of 5th all year, and its teammates didn't fare much better. The number 35 car was ranked 14th with a single podium, and the number 37 all the way down in 21st. It was a far cry from the Castrol Mugen NSX, the secondary hero car of GT3 if you will, which ended up as the series champion. Moving on to GT4, the 2000 car would be joined by its successor, the 2001 Castrol TOMS Supra. This car first appeared in 2002's Gran Turismo concept, but most would recognise it from GT4. This car is somewhat forgotten as its livery no longer had the classic Castrol swoops, instead going with a more conventional gradient pattern. In real life, it did maintain the old livery until round 4 of the season, when it was then updated in line with Castrol's rebranding and their new logo. The car would once again achieve a best finish of 5th, with their highest ranked driver ending up in 12th overall. And as it would turn out, 2001 ended up being the final year that Castrol would be the title sponsor of TOMS number 36 car. But with GT5 in 2010, there would be a new Castrol Supra joining the fold. This is where the 1997 car finally comes in. It seems like the idea was to bring back a beloved car from the series past, fully rebuilt as a premium model. However, instead of choosing the 1996 car that appeared in GT1 and GT2, they chose the 1997 instead. You can understand the reasoning here. 1997 was the year that Gran Turismo first released in Japan, and of course this car won the GT500 championship that year. It just makes too much sense. Honestly, the bigger question is why they chose the 96 car for GT1 in the first place. This decision truly established the 1997 Castrol TOMS Supra as the beloved icon that it is today. After missing out in GT Sport, the car reappeared in GT7. Once again, it was quite prominent, especially in trailers and various other marketing. It was even included as a bonus for those who pre-ordered the game. So that's the story of the Castrol TOMS Supra in Gran Turismo. What appears as just a single car is actually 5 different model years. In fact, the only Castrol TOMS Supras that have never appeared in this series are the 1995 and 1998 cars. Now after 2001, TOMS still competed in GT500 with different sponsors, and some of their later cars would go on to appear in this series as well. The Wood 1 TOMS Supra was in GT4, 5 and 6, the Petronas TOMS SC430 from GT5 through to GT7, and the AU TOMS RCF in GT Sport and GT7. The Castrol livery is of course a big part of why this car is so memorable. This specific design was first seen back in 1993 on Toyota's Group A Celica rally cars, and it was recently resurrected to be used on a GR Yaris Rally 2 competing in the British Rally Championship. Most bizarrely, it was also recently used as a one-off in a Darlington NASCAR race by RFK Racing on Brad Keselowski's Ford Mustang, taking direct inspiration from the Supra. In some ways, you could consider the Toyota Minolta 88CV as a predecessor to the Castrol Supra. It too was run by Team Toms, bearing their number 36, and it competed in the Japan Sports Prototype Championship, what was Japan's top sports car series before the JGTC. That's a fun piece of trivia tying together two of Gran Turismo's most noteworthy cars. So the story of the Castrol Supra in Gran Turismo is probably a bit more convoluted than most would realise. But even still, one thing should be very clear. This is the car of Gran Turismo. There are many cars that we associate with these games, but none of them encapsulate what Gran Turismo is, or rather used to be, more than the 1997 Toyota Castrol Toms Supra. Now, this is where the video would normally end, but I have just one more car that I'd like to talk about. It would be a complete contradiction to include a car in this video about Gran Turismo's iconic cars and say that it has been forgotten by most people. And yet, there is a single car that does fit both of those descriptions. Once again, let me ask you a question. When booting up the original Gran Turismo, what is the first car that players will ever see? Well, assuming you didn't skip the intro, it would be this, the Nismo GT-R LM road car. In fact, you see it 3 separate times before you see a single other car. But it wasn't just the road car in GT1, there was also the GT-R LM race car. This was one of the fastest cars in the game, and so a very tough opponent when it appeared in events like the GT World Cup. In real life, this car was created, once again, to take on the Le Mans 24 Hours. It was built to GT1 regulations, meaning that it had to be converted to rear-wheel drive. 2 cars were entered in 1995, with only one reaching the finish in 10th overall and 5th in the GT1 class. For 1996, they could only achieve 15th overall and 10th in GT1, before being replaced by the R390 GT1 for 1997. So the car wasn't very successful, but that didn't stop it from taking centre stage in Gran Turismo. It's also noteworthy that after beating the GT World Cup and receiving the end credits, the final scene before fading to black shows the GT-R LM race car driving over the hill into the sunset. It's quite symbolic. The game started with the road car being unloaded, and it ended with the race car driving off. If you ask me, the GT-R LM seemed to get a bigger spotlight than the Castrol Supra here. Of course, this was back before hero cars were really a thing in the series, but if I had to pick one for this game, I'd say it was the Nismo. For GT2, only the road car returned. This is because the race car became incorporated as the racing modification of the road car. Strangely enough, the car isn't playable in the Japanese version of GT2. This is because it doesn't appear in the Nissan dealership. It's believed that this was an error, as the car is still present in the files and appears in the international versions with no issues. But GT3 is where this car would really start to fade into the background. For one, only the road car made the transition. This was somewhat understandable, given that GT3 was limited in terms of content, and so cuts clearly had to be made. Sadly, it doesn't feature in this game very much. You can win it from a couple of higher end events, but it's very rarely seen in the game outside of that. Honestly, you could play through this entire game and not even realise it was included until right at the end. And that's a shame, because it's not as if the car had the performance to warrant that. It only had 300 horsepower, no all-wheel drive system, and it somehow weighed 1,580 kilograms. That is more than the standard R33 GT-R road car. And that's kind of how things stayed. The road car reappeared in GT4, 5 and 6, but the race car sadly never returned. I've always found this a rather bizarre decision. I mean, could you imagine them including the R390 road car, but not the race car? Which is the whole reason why it exists in the first place. It wouldn't make any sense. And given that the road car wasn't anywhere near as quick as it looked, and was also very overpriced, most people kind of forgot about it all too easily. It didn't help that it was a standard model, and not a particularly good one either. If they had chosen to bring the race car over, I think it would have been more fondly remembered. I mean, this car represents the only time that a GT-R has ever raced at Le Mans. Well, aside from the similarly named GT-R LM Nismo, but that's something else entirely. The car isn't too dissimilar to the R33s that competed in GT500. Visually, they look pretty close, have similar performance, and are also rear-wheel drive. But it's worth noting that none of them made it out of the PS1 era either. In that sense, the Nismo GT-R LM offers something that we don't have in current Gran Turismo, a thoroughbred rear-wheel drive racing variant of the R33 Skyline. If we have a look at the GT7 release date trailer from September 2021, we can find something very interesting. I've previously called this the nostalgia bait trailer, because of all of the clear references it makes to the intros of past GT games. And part of this is, of course, an homage to GT1's intro. But as we know, the GT-R LM didn't return in GT7 either, so for the shot mimicking the car being unloaded from the trailer, they instead used the Castrol Tom's Supra. Once again, this is pretty symbolic. It tells you all you really need to know about how the dynamic between these two cars shifted over time. So that was the story of the Nismo GT-R LM. A car that wasn't particularly noteworthy in real life, but thanks to these games, did briefly get some time in the spotlight. It is the near-forgotten legend of Gran Turismo.